All right, good afternoon, everyone. I want to offer a special thanks to Arlen Peebles and the Ed Leaders Network for providing me with this platform. I'm extremely grateful and honored to be here with you today to talk about the power and potency of school culture. Before I dive into a very brief introduction of me and who I am, I want to pose a question, and I would love if folks could jot their thoughts and ideas down in the chat. And that question is as follows: what are the aspirations, dreams, and desires of the children and families you serve? What are the aspirations, dreams, and desires of the children and families you serve? If you could take a few seconds and just jot down your ideas in the chat. And I want you to think about those dreams, desires, and aspirations as we are talking today about school culture and its power in shaping the lives of our students. Again, would love to see a couple of contributions in the chat. So I'm seeing a couple things. Nancy says they want to be self-sufficient and productive to thrive in their environment. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Lori. Thanks, Kate. Sounds like she's writing from the perspective of a family for their child to be successful and happy human beings in this world. Darren says to graduate, to be a contributing member of the community. And Gina says our children and families have aspirations of learning, success, and growth. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to put a pin on this particular question because we're going to come back to that later on. I'm going to share my screen now. And I just want to say a few words about who I am and who's going to be spending this next 50 minutes or so with you. So I'm Lionel Allen Jr., and I'm coming to you live from the South Side of Chicago. I'm a proud graduate of Chicago Public Schools. And I've been an educator for the entirety of my professional life. I was fortunate to know very early on that I wanted to be an educator. Didn't quite know what that meant back when I was 15, 16 years old, when I felt like I was called to this wonderful profession. But I'm very grateful again to be doing the work that I love to do. Right now, I'm a member of the faculty of the Educational Policy Studies Department at the University of Illinois at Chicago. But prior to my time at UIC, I spent about 20 years in K-12 education. So I started out as a teacher assistant. I was a summer school teacher. I taught history at Oak Park River Forest High School, just outside of Chicago. Been an assistant principal, a turnaround principal, and chief academic officer of a network of all-male high schools. So I've seen and had the good fortune of having really divergent experiences throughout my time in education. I've served in traditional public schools, charter schools, high schools, elementary schools. And again, I just feel very fortunate that I've had this sort of breadth and depth of experiences that have really shaped me into the individual that I am today. I have three objectives for this afternoon's webinar. First, I want to detail the power and potency of school culture in shaping and transforming the lives of our children. Second, I want to introduce you to the C.A.R.E framework. It's a framework that I designed a few years ago to really help us understand the pillars that our school cultures should rest upon. And then lastly, I want to operationalize each pillar of the framework. We love in education to sort of inundate ourselves with a bunch of educational jargon. So we throw around phrases like cultural responsiveness and equity and belonging, but we don't define those terms. And so while they sound great, it's hard to get people to mobilize around these terms because folks don't really know what it looks like in practice. And so one of my objectives today is for you to walk out of this session being able to say, I know as a culturally responsive educator, some things that I should be doing or trying to do in my school and in my community. My hope today is that you see the simplicity of this framework that I'm going to share with you. It does not require you to invest thousands of dollars in new technology. You don't have to go out and purchase a new curriculum. You can certainly purchase my book, but that's it. That's $30, right? It doesn't require you to spend a lot of money trying to invest in new things, right? That doesn't require you to do that. But what it does require you to do, educators, is to begin to interrogate your own mindsets and to engage in critical self-reflection on your practices and on your beliefs as educators. So CARE is an acronym, as you can see here, that stands for cultural responsiveness, affirmation, relationships, and empowerment. And my theory of action is pretty clear. And that is, if schools establish a culture built on cultural responsiveness, affirmation, relationships, and empowerment, then they would dramatically and drastically improve the academic experiences of often marginalized student groups. Now, as you are listening to me sort of present this idea, I want you to begin to think about who are the marginalized student groups that you serve. So what I would like for you to do now is just to take a few seconds and in the chat, enter who you have defined in your schools, in your communities, as the marginalized students or the minoritized student groups. And the reason why I want you to do this is because I don't want you to presume that I am telling you who the marginalized students are, right? Only you know that. You know your school community better than I do. In the communities that I've worked in, African American students were often the marginalized or the minoritized groups. Diverse learners were often the marginalized or minoritized groups. In some settings I've worked in, female students were the marginalized and minoritized students. So I want you to think about who those students are, because as we think about this framework and as I roll this framework out to you, I want you to center them and their needs so that when you go back to school tomorrow and then next week, you begin thinking about the strategies that you can employ, some of which I'm going to share with you today, to really help improve their experiences. The beauty, again, of this framework is that if you employ these strategies with the right mindset and the right heart, everybody benefits from it. Everybody benefits from it. Now, again, when I think about historically marginalized groups, of course, I think about African American students. I think about African American males in particular. I think about Latinx students, but I also think about English language learners. I think about our white students who live in rural areas, who don't have access to a lot of the technologies and things that students in the big city have access to, who sometimes are struggling with poverty and disenfranchisement. So those are the students that I'm thinking about. But again, I want you to center the students that you serve that you deem to be minoritized, marginalized, or othered within your school context. Now, we pay lip service to this idea that school culture matters. And I think we know that so intellectually. But one of the things that experience teaches us, but also the research, empirical research also sort of informs us of this as well, and that is we have not been as deliberate and intentional as we need to be in creating the kind of school culture that guarantees that every child has an opportunity to be successful within our schools. Now, I want to be very clear about what I just said, that the goal should be that we create a culture that guarantees that every child has an opportunity to be successful in our schools. Doesn't define what that success is, doesn't define what it looks like, doesn't say anything about test scores, doesn't say anything about achievement, right? Doesn't say anything about outcomes. And the reason why I'm calling that out is because it is my belief that our collective focus on results, outcomes, and school rankings have created oppressive and joyless schools for many of our children. Now, I want to be clear. I acknowledge that our schools are working for some children. But we want to make sure that our schools are designed to provide every child with an opportunity to be successful. Not just those who have the political and social capital, not just those that come from affluent backgrounds, not just those whose parents have leadership positions within the school community, but all children. And again, one of the things that's very difficult for adults who work in schools to accept is that we don't control results. We don't control outcomes. Yet we've become so laser focused on outcomes and results that we have undermined the experiences of the children that we serve. School culture is important, educators, because it reveals the narratives that we hold about the students and the families that we serve, right? It reveals the narratives. In other words, what we think about our children and the families that we serve and the communities that they come from and how we truly feel about them is manifested in how we design and structure our school cultures. So if we fear the communities of children and families that we serve, then we tend to have a school culture that is punitive. If we have low expectations of the children and families that we serve, then we see those low expectations play out in what we think that they're capable of intellectually and academically. So the school culture, again, it reveals what we think about our families. It reveals what we think about our children. All too often, we define our students and families by their deficits. And one of the things that we know is that we only define people by their deficits when they don't have agency, when they don't have capital, when we don't fully acknowledge their humanity. And so when we define those who we serve by their deficits, again, we structure a culture that's based on deficit understanding of who our children and families are. And that undermines their academic experience. So for me, results and outcomes are just a symptom or indicator of the type of academic experiences that our children are having within our schools. We have a culture in many of our schools now that protects people's rights, using quotation marks there, to blame children and families for their lack of success and achievement within our schools. This is problematic for a multitude of reasons. But I want to take the words of this very wise sharecropper who says, if a farmer is trying to grow corn and the corn don't grow, he don't blame the corn. Right? Our children have been entrusted to us as educators. Our job is to grow them, right? To develop them academically, socially, intellectually, et cetera, et cetera. If they aren't growing, it's not because of them. It's because of things that we are doing or not doing. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that external factors don't matter. They certainly do. But I want us to understand that the culture of our school is the soil by which our students grow from. All right, it's the soil. And if our students aren't growing, some of the reason they're not growing is due to the toxicity of the soil that exists within our schools. And so if we want our students to grow, yes, there are factors outside of our control. But if we want our students to grow, we have to change the soil. We have to be willing to change the soil. We have to be willing to examine how much sunlight are we shining on our students. We have to be willing to, again, examine our own mindsets. And part of that is rejecting this idea that it's okay to blame children and families when they struggle within schools that we control, that we set policies for, that we employ practices in, right? It's on us to take that responsibility. Peter Drucker says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Peter Drucker is a world-renowned organizational management guru, consultant. And he says, look, you can have all the strategies in the world. If the culture is not designed to allow that strategy to take root. If the mindsets of the folks within the organization are not open to implement the new strategy with fidelity, then it doesn't matter what strategy it is. It doesn't matter how much money you've invested in that strategy. And even though this quote really applies to, or he intended it to apply to businesses, corporations, private sector industries, it's also applicable to schools. Because what we find ourselves oftentimes doing in schools is we're on this strategy treadmill that we are constantly trying to implement the new latest strategy. So we spend money on fancy consultants, and I happen to be a consultant, so I recognize that the tension there that I often feel myself as a consultant, going into spaces and people asking me, "Can you just tell us what to do? Can you just tell us the 4 or 5 things that we need to do to improve our schools?" And it just doesn't work like that. You can spend thousands of dollars on iPads and smart boards and other tools, right? But that's just it. Like, strategies are simply tools, but if you put those strategies in the hands of the wrong people, they become destructive. Right? You take a hammer, you put the hammer in the hands of a carpenter, and they can build and they can construct beautiful things. But you put a hammer in the hands of the wrong person, and the only thing they can do is destroy and be destructive. And so my call to action for all of you is to resist this desire, this dependence on new strategy, and think about the culture of our schools and how our cultures are either set up for our students to be successful or it's not. And there really is no middle ground. There really is no middle ground. I end this portion of the webinar talking about the importance of culture by drawing on this African proverb that says, "The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth." When a school culture does not embrace all children, when the school culture others children and families, you create an environment where students and sometimes parents and families and loved ones will engage in destructive behaviors to get the attention that they long for and deserve. I see it every day when I go into schools and I'm working with school leaders and teachers who are struggling with behavior issues. And they say, "I don't understand why my children are behaving so poorly in this class." And I say, well, a child who's engaging in bad behavior is communicating to you that their needs aren't being met. Now, certainly there are children who are experiencing things outside of school and maybe dealing with trauma that impact their ability to focus and to behave according to the standards that we have set. But the majority of children who are misbehaving in class are misbehaving because they're trying to communicate needs that aren't being met. Right? It's their way of communicating to us without the language that we typically acknowledge, understand, and validate as adults. And so we have children across our country in many school districts that are burning down the proverbial village in a lot of different ways, right? Bad behavior in classrooms, being disrespectful to teachers, bullying, all kinds of destructive behaviors because they don't feel embraced. When you talk to students who don't come to school regularly or students who are pushed out of school and decide at some point, "I don't want to go back to school," they'll tell you, "I never felt wanted in school." My father, who I dedicated my book to my family, but I wrote the book thinking about my father, who, one of the smartest men that I've ever met, an avid reader, could talk to you about anything, sports, politics, didn't matter, didn't graduate from high school. And when I became an educator and I said, "Dad, why didn't you finish school? You're so smart." He said, "School wasn't for cats like me." That's an exact quote. "School wasn't for cats like me. I never felt welcomed in school. I never felt like they wanted me there." My father stuttered. And so the fact that he stuttered and was an African-American male and, was not seen by his teachers as someone who was brilliant, he felt pushed out. And so by the time he became a sophomore in high school, he made a decision to no longer attend school. And I'm not calling my father a dropout, because to use the phrase dropout implies that he no longer wanted to go to school. The reality was he was pushed out. It wasn't that he didn't want to go to school, he felt like he wasn't wanted in school. That's a difference. And so I think about all the children today, generations of children who did not feel embraced by the school village, who opted not to attend school because they had been pushed out, receiving messages year after year, you're not wanted here. And then we label them a dropout. Again, it goes back to we're blaming the victims of a system that did harm to kids. So we, as individuals who want to create cultures of care, have to recognize when we see students acting out, it's not because the student woke up that day and said, I'm going to go and I'm going to act out in school. I'm going to, tear up Miss Jackson's classroom. No, the student didn't make that decision. The student is making the decision because they feel like their needs aren't being met and they don't have another way to voice their concern. They don't have a union to protect their rights. They can't join the local school council to talk about how their needs aren't being met. So what do? They misbehave in class. They misbehave in class. So what I want to do now is I want to unpack each pillar of the framework. And I want to start with the C of the culture of care framework, which is cultural responsiveness. And so this pillar forces us to examine what does it mean for us to be a culturally responsive educator. So what I want you to do right now in the chat, if you will, is just to jot down a couple words or phrases that come to mind when you think of the term cultural responsiveness, right? What does it mean in your mind as you hear that phrase? What does that mean? What words or images are conjured up in your mind as you think about the term cultural responsiveness? And just put it in the chat, if you don't mind. When we think of the term cultural responsiveness, what comes to mind? How are you making sense? Thanks, Kate. Respect for diversity in our words, actions, books, language. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Anything else? Anybody else want to? Thank you, Darren. Taking into account the differences relative to what the student is learning. Yeah, all of these things. Very, very important. Very important. People feeling seen, heard, trusted, respected. All of these things. And everything that you listed, thank you all for your contributions. Everything that you listed, there was not one single word or phrase that pointed to an outcome or a quantifiable measure that we need to be looking at, right? Like that's because we know that those things really aren't important. Gloria Lasson-Billings says that to be culturally responsive is to create a school or classroom environment that acknowledges, responds to, and celebrates the diversity of our students. We celebrate it. We celebrate it. We acknowledge it. We respond to it. We see cultural diversity as an asset. We see it as something that actually enriches the learning experiences of our students. So it's more than just having a few, books by Black authors or Latinx authors in the classroom library. It's more than just celebrating students during Cultural Awareness Month, right? Like it's nice to celebrate, Latino students during Hispanic Heritage Month. That's cool. We should do that. We should celebrate women during Women's History Month. We should celebrate African American contributions during African American History Month, right? We know those things, but it should be something that's built into the fabric of how we do school, so that students aren't just learning about the contributions of their people, or students aren't just learning about the contributions of other people during those designated months. It should be a rich environment where we're always learning about the contributions of different cultures and people who are different from us. That's our responsibility as a school, right? In order to be a culturally responsive educator, you have to reject ideas of sameness and color blindness and stereotypes. So when I think about the portrait of a culturally responsive educator, it's important that we enact our roles as individuals who lean into racial and cultural differences, right? It's not about treating everybody the same. It's not about necessarily equality. It's about fairness. It's about equity. It's about justice. We live in a highly racialized society, and students' lives are fundamentally different based on their racialized identities. Just the experience that a Black and a white student have just walking to school in the morning is different. It's fundamentally different. So our schools have to respond to those differences. And we respond to that by bringing the experiences of all students into the classroom, into the school, so that students can see themselves in what they read, the math problems that they have to solve, in the music that they listen to in school, in the songs that the band plays, where they see themselves in all aspects. Someone said it's important that in a culturally responsive environment that all students feel seen and heard. That's absolutely right, because so many historically marginalized students, minoritized students, suffer with either hypervisibility, which means that if they cough funny in the classroom, they get put out, or invisibility, where they're never seen or heard. And so we as culturally responsive educators want to make sure that we reject our biases and reject our stereotypes. And again, lean into those differences and see them as assets and not liabilities. One simple way that a school can begin to create a more culturally responsive environment is by conducting community walks. Now, I don't know, the schools that you represent, and I don't know if they are neighborhood schools. I don't know if they are magnet schools. I don't know if they're private schools. But those of us who serve in schools where our students are coming from the same neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that surround the schools, I highly recommend conducting the community walks. One of the best professional development experiences that I've ever had as a principal, when I was a turnaround principal at a school in Inglewood on the south side of Chicago, I recognized that many of my teachers came to this school with deficit-oriented constructions of the students and the communities that they came from. Here's what's also interesting. I recognize that I harbored similar deficit thinking. That even as a Black man who grew up on the south side of Chicago, I saw that community from a deficit lens. And I had to acknowledge that. And one of the ways that I responded to that acknowledgement was to step outside the comfort of my office and bring my teachers and my staff outside into the community to actually see what the community was made of. So they can begin to understand that, yes, the community struggled with gang violence and it struggled with poverty, disfranchisement, all the things that we talk about, drug abuse, unemployment, all the social ills that we know exist within urban communities. But there was also really strong, brilliant, hardworking people in that neighborhood. And we needed to see that. I couldn't just give them some data and say, look at all of the great institutions that exist within the community. That wasn't going to be enough. I needed them to have an experience that will force them to rethink and to challenge the narratives and the stereotypes that they held in their heads. And the only way I can do that, because these are adults and not children, the only way I can do that is by giving them an experience that forced them to do that. I couldn't tell them. They had to learn it on their own. So we visited the homeless shelter, and we learned about the battered women's shelter that existed right across the street from the school. And we learned about the libraries, and we went inside the library, went inside the park district that had this beautiful pond that folks could fish in and all these resources for families. They got a chance to see all of these folks who were working to strengthen the community. This wasn't stuff that you would hear about on the news. They had to see it for themselves. No, these students aren't students of poverty. These aren't poor kids. They just happen to be kids who live in a poor community. But there's brilliance here, but they have to see it. It forced us to examine and confront our biases and our stereotypes. Again, one of the best experiences that I had, and guess what? It was free. It didn't cost us a dime. All we had to do was have the will to step outside of our school and to walk the neighborhood and to engage with people who we might not otherwise engage with. The next strategy that I suggest that schools who are really committed to this work begin to employ is to hire or begin to grow your own teachers of color, teachers who represent the identities of the students that you are serving. Within many schools, there exists a racialized hierarchy. And this is what I mean. Let's take a predominantly African American and Latinx school. In many instances, in those types of schools, all the teachers are white, all the support staff are African American or Latinx. Deans of security, African American and Latinx. So we have to be mindful of the messages that we send. Let me be very clear. My father, who I just spoke about, he was a custodian. He was a custodian actually in the College of Education. The building that I now go to as a professor every day. But he worked hard as a custodian, took pride in his job. So I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with being a custodian, anything wrong with being a security officer. What I am saying is, if that's the only representation that students see of themselves, then that's a problem. So yeah, they need to see the custodian, they need to see the lunchroom workers, that's important. But they also need to see people who look like them teaching and leading and in positions of power. Because when we don't do that, we disempower students. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Representation matters. Now, I know people will say, well, it's hard to find, teachers of color. You're right. There's reasons for that we won't get into today. If you are having a hard time finding folks from outside the community who are people of color to come in and teach, then it's your responsibility. We can start right now growing our own. There are probably teacher assistants who are people of color who maybe have not finished school. How can we support them through their educational journey? There might be parents who have served as substitute teachers. How can we help them along their educational journey? There are ways to grow your own. We just have to have the courage and be willing to be creative and imaginative enough to make it happen. Representation matters, and we have to center that if we're trying to create culturally responsive learning environments. The last strategy that I'll share in an effort to become a more culturally responsive educator is to shadow a student. Again, another really, really important experience that I had as a school leader and teacher. I just chose a random student, and I followed that student the entire day, from entry to dismissal. I visited every class. I sat through the entirety of every class, and I ate the school lunch. I did everything that the student did because I wanted to understand the student experience. All of us have a shared experience. At some point, we went to school. And so when we become teachers and leaders in schools, we think that we know because, I went to school. We all went to school. But the reality is we know nothing about what it means to be a student right now. We know nothing about the pressures associated with being a student right now. The only way that we can even begin to test the waters of what it feels like to be a student is to follow a student around for the entire day. See what it feels like. What does it feel like to sit through 8 periods or 10 periods in a school day? Right? What does it feel like to have to balance having 3, 4, 5 tests on a Friday because all the teachers in the school give their tests on a Friday? It will broaden your perspective. It'll broaden the lens that you're looking through. It'll help you to point out the challenges that students are having. It'll help you point out the challenges that teachers are having. But most importantly, educators, it'll make you more empathetic to the students and families that you serve. Because now you're willingly putting yourself in their shoes. Again, this is a strategy that you can employ tomorrow, Monday, Tuesday, and guess what? It's free. All you have to do is be willing to clear your calendar for the day. It's a worthwhile experience. It's something that I suggest everybody takes an opportunity to do. I want to move now because we're coming up on time. I only have about 15, 20 more minutes, and I want to transition now to the A of the C.A.R.E framework, and that is affirmation. And so the guiding question here that I want you to think about is, do students feel good about who they are when they enter your school or classroom? Do they feel good about who they are when they enter your school or classroom? And so I want you to in the chat now. Answer that question, and I want you to tell us how. How you know? How do you know if students feel good about who they are? You know, one of the things that you'll learn about me, and this is maybe a little bit off topic, is I really hate social media, and I understand that there's some good that can come with it, but I truly despise social media because of what it does to our children. What it does to our children is problematic. For so many of our students, they are bombarded with negative messages about themselves and who they are. Right? There's a saying, comparison is the thief of joy. And that's all social media has become for so many of our children, is them comparing their lives to others. Comparing what they have or don't have to people who have, and it creates a culture where, for the first time in our history, we've seen rates of suicide and depression that we've never seen. Like, we're seeing the impact. And I know some of it comes out of COVID and those kinds of things, but a lot of it is driven by the dangers of social media and what it does to our kids' brains. And the reason why I bring that up is because it is important for us to create an environment that affirms who they are, that makes them feel good about who they are, because we have to combat all those negative messages they've been subjected to. Sometimes via social media, sometimes in their home, sometimes from other places and other sources. So we have to be committed to them. Essentially, to affirm a student is to make sure that children feel good about who they are, even if they are not who you want them to be. Right? It's about honoring who the student is. It's not about devaluing them because they aren't who you want them to be. Every child should come to school and feel good. They should come to school with a smile. They should be excited to come to school because they know that there are people there who are waiting on them, who love them and care about them, who want to invest in them. So here's a couple ways that we can affirm our students. Everything I'm going to share with you is free. The first strategy is to begin each day or begin each class with a positive affirmation or creed. When I was a turnaround principal, this was the creed that our students recited every morning. And the reason why we did that is because it was a turnaround school that I took over. It was labeled a failing school. All the adults have been fired. All their teachers have been fired. It was the students, though, who bore the burden of that label. They felt like they had failed their teachers. They felt like failures. We had to go in, we had to rebuild their academic self-esteem. So we started each morning with them saying, hey, I am a student seeking to be a scholar. The standard is excellence today and tomorrow. Every day they said. Every day they said, I'm on a mission to elevate myself, my family, my community, and humanity. Every day they said that. And we know that there's power in words. Just like students who listen to rap music, even if they are from a predominantly white, rich community, when they start reciting the lyrics of rappers who live in very different environments, they begin to take on the identity similar to that rapper that's coming from a totally different background and space. They begin to think that they're gangsters. They live in a mansion, but they think they're a gangster because they can recite the rap lyrics from a gangster rapper. We see it happening all the time, right? Well, the reverse is true. If a student says every day that I'm disciplined, focused, and on time, that I'm organized, respectful, and responsible, eventually they'll begin to believe it and they'll act responsible. They'll act disciplined. They'll act focused. They'll be on time. They'll see themselves as scholars. But we have to create the conditions. We have to put the systems in place for them to begin to recite these affirmations so they begin to believe this about themselves. The second thing that we can do to affirm our students is to praise their effort, not necessarily just the results. Sure, we want to celebrate those students that earn a perfect score on the test. Sure, we want to celebrate our high achievers. But when we only celebrate our high achievers and the students who earn the perfect scores, we dismiss the efforts of all the other students who may be trying hard but just have missed the mark, but they're coming close to it. Teresa Perry calls this effort optimism. She says if we praise the effort of our students, we boost their confidence, and they want to put in more effort because I'm being praised for effort. So guess what? If you praise me for my effort, I'll put in more effort. As they put in more effort, eventually they begin to see the results. They begin to see the fruits of their labor. But we got to be willing to celebrate those students. We got to be willing to celebrate. Hey, you know what? You have made so much progress. I am so proud of you. You come to class every day. You try hard every day. Keep working hard. Keep trying. I know you didn't do as well on that test as you wanted to, but you're coming close. Keep putting in the effort. That'll change a student's life. Just you saying that. Didn't cost you a dime. My heart breaks when I go into school sometimes and I know what kids are going through just to come to school every day. And they show up and the first face they see is someone yelling at them for being tardy. Now, this kid had to wake up, make breakfast for his or her siblings, walk all of her siblings to school, right? Traverse through dangerous territory. They're finally here. They're 10 minutes late. And the first face they see is yelling at them for being tardy. You have no idea what that kid had to go through to make it to school. What if we praise that kid? Hey, I know you're late. Let's get to class. I'm so happy you're here. Come on, let's get it in order. That's okay. I don't care that you're late. I'm just glad you're here. I'm glad you put in the effort to be here. I appreciate the effort you put in to get here because, someone else might not have done it. They would have found a way out and you didn't. You found a way in. I'm happy that you're here. Praise effort and not result. Doesn't cost a dime. We could do it in our classrooms. We could do it outside of class. Another strategy that we can employ to affirm our students is to make a positive phone call home. So many of our parents, every time the school phone rings or the phone rings and they see it's the school, they won't answer. Why? Because every time the school is called, all they've ever heard is something negative about their child. And so many of our parents have also had negative experiences in school. Doesn't cost us a dime to pick up the phone and say, hey, Miss Peoples, I just want to tell you that Arlen was fantastic today. He was awesome. Participated. He was a good citizen. He helped his classmates when they needed him. I'm happy to have him in my classroom. That's all I wanted. Take care. Talk to you soon. That'll change the relationship that you have with that parent. It'll make that kid feel so much better about themselves. And I guarantee you that kid is going to be a harder working student for you if you just made one positive phone call home. But again, we got to be willing to systematize it. It's something that we all should be doing. We should be looking for things to say about our kids, the students that we serve. That's positive. Make a positive phone call home. Doesn't cost us a dime. I want to move now into relationships. And the question for us to think about here as we come up on the last few minutes of our time together is, am I willing to invest the time, effort, and energy into establishing authentic relationships with the students that I serve? It's a choice. Either you are or you aren't. And there are too many people that I've come across, unfortunately, that believe that as an educator, as a teacher, my job is to teach and the job of the students is to learn. I'm not here to make relationships. I'm not here to make friends. And that's really an unfortunate way of thinking about, our roles as educators. Right? We know that establishing a relationship is about establishing rapport and that social emotional connection with our students so that they feel supported, cared for, and seen. Right? And we know that they would be more willing to comply, more willing to take risks if they have a relationship with us. And that's both students and families. But it's important because we know that schools are institutions of learning. And we have to be willing to acknowledge, as Dr. James Comer said years ago, that no significant learning occurs without a significant relationship. That you cannot teach, you cannot impart knowledge or wisdom or dispositions with our children if you don't have a relationship with them. It just won't happen, right? And then Rita Pearson, she said it best in her TED Talk, rest in peace, Miss Pearson, right? Kids don't learn from people that they don't like. Doesn't mean that you have to go out of your way to be friends with every student. That's not what we're saying. But what we are saying is that the learning cannot happen until you prioritize the relationship, until you forge that human connection with the child that you're trying to teach. So here are a couple ways you can do that. Again, all of these strategies are free. And some of you might be listening to me and saying, duh, but you'll be surprised at how often, and I'm going to talk about this first strategy first, a teacher does not stand outside his or her classroom to greet students as they come in. Just standing at the door as students come in and smiling at them and saying good morning, making students feel like you're happy for them to be there, helps set the foundation for a positive relationship. Giving them a fist bump or a handshake or a hug changes the dynamic of the relationship. Making a kid feel wanted, feeling like they're connected to you is the name of the game here. Starting each day with a social emotional check-in. I use these even with my doctoral students, who also, even though they're at the highest heights, they're pursuing a terminal degree, excuse me. They're pursuing a terminal degree, and they still need the relationship with the professor to be their best selves. So I start every class with the 2-word check-in. Jot down 2 words that best describe how you feel. Choose the emoji that best represents how you feel today. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One, I want to gauge the energy in the room. I want to know how they are feeling. I also want them to understand that it's okay to have competing emotions, to grapple with competing emotions, that you can be happy but exhausted at the same time, that's okay. But most importantly, what I want my students to see, regardless of the age level that I'm working with, I want them to see and understand that I recognize their humanity and that I see them as more than just an empty vessel to deposit knowledge into, but they are living, breathing, feeling human beings. Doesn't take but 5 minutes of class time to do an SEL check-in. I hear so many teachers say, I got to get to the content. I got to open up your math textbooks and turn to page 7 without knowing if kids are in a good space, without knowing anything about what happened in the class before. Like, how can you expect someone to learn if you haven't checked in on them mentally, emotionally, socially? It's not going to happen. Sometimes we just got to shut up and listen. And so one of the strategies that I often encourage educators to employ in their schools is to find ways to create space in the classroom for them to listen to their students. I did it, and I wrote about this in the book, by having current events Friday, where on Friday, every other Friday, we didn't talk about history. We talked about what was happening in their neighborhoods. We talked about things that they wanted to discuss. They brought in newspaper articles that intrigued them, and we had conversations about the things that they wanted to talk about. I learned a great deal about my students and the things that they worried about from these current event Fridays. And when I run into former students, they never talk about the great lesson I did on Manifest Destiny or the great lesson we did on the Civil War. They talk about current events Fridays, and they talk about how much they appreciated that, because I made them feel like I was listening to them and that I cared about the things that they cared about. The last thing that we can all do, again, these are all free strategies that we can do to create that relationship with our students, is to go see them where they are. Meaning that if you have students that's athletes, go see them play and compete. If you have a student that's a musician, go see them at their piano recital. If you teach older kids and they work at the local Target, go to Target and see them in that environment. Like, go and see them do their thing so you can understand the fullness of their humanity and all the other things that they have going on in their lives besides just being a student. It's so important that we see students for all of who they are. The last pillar of the framework is the empowerment pillar, the E. And the guiding question here is, how are we empowering students or giving them permission to realize their full potential? When we think about this idea of empowerment, we want our students to see and realize and own the potential and the abilities that they have. And we want to grant them that authority to be great, to take control over their lives. And it's unfortunate how we sometimes disempower students unintentionally. But here are some ways that we can be very intentional about empowering our students. The first thing we have to do is we have to start to reject deficit language. So terms like the achievement gap are problematic for a number of reasons. One, it blames students for not performing well on tests. Two, it compares demographic groups of students to each other who have fundamentally different in-school experiences. So it's not an apples to apples comparison. I won't say much more about that, but there's a reason why the achievement gap should be language or term that we bury. Attitude gap is another term that blames kids. There are students who deserve to have a bad attitude. The way they are treated, the way they are dismissed, the way they are disempowered, there are students who absolutely deserve to have an attitude. We might not like to accept that or might not be willing to accept it. I'm not saying they have a right to be disrespectful, but they do have a right to be upset with how they are being treated in schools. And so we have to, again, we got to reject this language that blames kids and blames families. We have to be willing, though, to acknowledge that while we don't have an achievement gap, we do have an opportunity gap. We know that talent is equally distributed, but opportunities are not. And within our schools, we oftentimes have situations where certain demographic groups, certain types of children have access to certain opportunities that others do not have. We have to be willing to acknowledge that. Lastly, we have to be willing to acknowledge that there's an expectation gap, that we have higher expectations for some students and families than we do for others. And that's a problem. So here's a couple ways that we can sort of empower students. One, let's grant students agency. Right? Let's give them agency over their academic experience. Let's give them choice, not just in what they learn, but how they learn it and how they demonstrate understanding, mastery, and proficiency. Quick example, studying the Civil War, my students could, at the end, write an essay based on some prompts that I provided. They could create a Civil War scrapbook where they were gathering artifacts and making artifacts that demonstrate that they had a deep understanding of the Civil War. They could draw a cartoon. What I'm trying to communicate here is that I gave students multiple ways to demonstrate proficiency. Not everybody can sit and take a multiple choice test and be good and get a good grade. Not everybody can sit and write a 5-paragraph essay. Our students are brilliant, but they're brilliant in different ways. And that brilliance shows up in a lot of different ways, in different modalities. And we have to be willing to honor that. So it's not just a choice in sort of what they learn, but how they learn it and how they demonstrate understanding, mastery, and proficiency. Again, it takes a mindset shift. Doesn't require you to go out and buy new curriculum materials, but it does require you to be a little bit more imaginative and creative, right? And giving students opportunities to show what they know. Once they graduate from school, very few professions will they show expertise through a test or through writing an essay. They're going to have to produce something. So why not give them a practice now in producing things that represent what they know and what they care about? We got to end the overemphasis on grading. We got to end the overemphasis on grading. Grades reduce children to data points in the grade book. And I was a teacher. I get it. We got to have grades. We know, unless we have the anti-grading revolution anytime soon, we're going to have grades. And I understand that. But what we can start to do now is de-emphasize the grade and focus more on the learning, creating a community of learners, right? That's what we want to do. We want to help students understand, hey, the grade is the grade. I used to tell my students all the time, look, you're going to get an A. It's all good. I don't care about that. What I care about is, are you learning and are you taking what we are learning and applying it to your day-to-day living? And when I said that, it's almost like I released them from this pressure because I don't care about the grade. What does a grade really represent? We know we've all been in schools where two teachers can be teaching the same subject in the same grade level, and an A will mean two different things because we have yet to come together and actually define what a grade means. So since we can't define what a grade means, maybe it's because the grades aren't that important to begin with. Let's reduce the overemphasis on grading. And the last thing I'll say is this. We have to prioritize the academic experiences over the outcomes of the results. I began with this earlier today when we first started. I said, look, because we have prioritized measurable outcomes, because we have, prioritized quantifiable results, quantifiable metrics over qualitative experiences, we've actually done more harm than good. I began today's webinar with a question, asking you what the dreams, desires, and aspirations of your students and families work? I'll close with a similar question, and that is your culture designed to help students achieve their dreams, their aspirations, and their desires? And if the answer to that question is no, then I pray that you have the courage to go back to your school and examine your culture and begin to do some things differently than you've done them in the past. I've given you a couple of strategies today to help you to build a culture that rests upon the pillars of cultural responsiveness, affirmation, relationships, and empowerment. And I hope that you have learned at least one thing that you can do starting tomorrow to help create that culture of care that our students deserve. Thank you all so much for your time today. I really appreciate you. And I hope that you found some value in today's experience.
Awesome. Dr. Allen, thank you so much for sharing your passion for this, all these free strategies on how to better lead with care. This was really fantastic. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here. And I hope that our paths cross again. Some of you with the webinar, I hope that I get a chance to see you soon. Thanks so much.
Excellent. And it is almost 4 o'clock. If there's any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. A lot of thank yous coming in, Dr. Allen. But I know we're running up against time, but if anybody has any last minute questions, we've got just one more minute with Dr. Allen before we close the webinar. Yes, Elizabeth, I have recorded this webinar and I'll be sending it out next week. I'll also be sending a link to the evaluation so you can give us some feedback on what you thought about the presentation. And then you can also earn 1 PD clock hour. And you'll get the ISB evidence of completion form. So yeah, we record all of our webinars and send them out after they're done being processed.
And someone just asked the name of the book, and I just put it in the chat.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Dr. Allen.
Yep.
Okay, it is now 4 o'clock. I'm not seeing any other questions for us in the chat. You are free to leave the webinar session for today. If you hover at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, you'll see a big red leave button in the lower right. You can click that. That will log you out of the session for today. And I will be following up next week with the recording and the evaluation. So thank you all so much for your attendance and participation. And Dr. Allen, thank you once again for being our presenter.
Thank you for having me. I really look forward to continuing our work together. Take good care.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.